Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Furudashi podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Ash, and I'm super excited to be sharing a nice little break from our Metal Gear gaming from this past year. And we're going to be talking about something that I'm really, really passionate about. And I'm here seated next to, digitally and spiritually, with an expert in this exact topic. Nicholas.
Spiritually sitting next to you.
I am spiritually sitting next to you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my,
I'll take it.
yeah, you should, in the ether, right? Digitally, spiritually, my consciousness is with you. Hi everyone, it's the end of the week, and when Nicholas and Lauren get together, we just love having a good time. But yeah, we're going to be talking about the digital preservation of video games today. And so to officially hand it off to our resident expert here at the Furudashi show, Nicholas, please introduce this topic that is, and why we're talking about preserving video games throughout history. And it has nothing to do with the fact that it has been so hard for me to find versions of these games to play. It has no way. Mm-mm.
No, it has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I finished playing Ground Zeroes and wanted to fly to Japan and personally murder Kojima. Like, it's got nothing to do with that.
We are not in support of any of these actions, just so we're clear.
Because I wouldn't do that.
No, we would never do that.
And also, we're delaying playing Metal Gear Solid 4, as we've mentioned in the past, because Konami is going to be releasing the second volume of the Master Collection in August, which will include Metal Gear Solid 4, so we'll be doing it at that time. We'll be doing it, I believe, for September's episode. So as a kind of I guess, intermission, if you will, because we are kind of at a midpoint in our recording for the year of Metal Gear. I kind of just not really at the last minute. I have been thinking about doing an episode on this for a while, just didn't really know where to fit it in. So we're going to talk today about preservation and the way in which it relates to sort of like analysis of video games and the study of the history of video games. And also because it leverages, believe it or not, I actually have a day job. I do not subsist on the money we make from our Patreon. No one would be able to subsist on that. But if you would like to contribute to the modest subsistence that it does provide, you can head on over to patreon.com/Furudashi, where you will get not only access to the free episodes, but also a bonus episode every month, in addition to, can you believe it, our entire back catalog of episodes, of bonus episodes, which is huge at this point. We're on our 6th year. There's a lot there. There's a lot to listen to. It's great stuff. Only $5 a month. You'll love it. So for my day job, I work in an academic library, specifically as a project manager for a bulk digitization project. For any of you who are in the know as to what that thing is, you probably have already guessed what it is, and also probably know why I can't be any more specific than that due to mountains of legal paperwork I had to sign. But with regards to sort of like broad questions about how preservation fits into sort of like the broader discussion around the history of video games, one of the things that I wanted to bring up before we talk about what I'm going to identify as 4 preservation modes as we go through the discussion is to talk about the difference between access and preservation. Sometimes things will be, like, I guess you could say, transferred into a different medium or into, like, for a different platform or what have you, not necessarily for the purposes of preservation, but for the purposes of access. And so even within, like, sort of the digitization world, oftentimes, like, for example, if I'm digitizing a book, if I have a book and I'm taking pictures of it and I want to produce a digital object, I am going to be producing two versions of that digital object. I'm going to be producing what's called an access copy, which is what will go up onto, say, any of various databases or institutional repositories. But I'm also going to be producing what is a preservation copy, which is generally like maintained at a much higher resolution. It will have like little bars along all the sides of the pages so that you can maintain white balance and so forth. The whole purpose of that is to be like as faithful to the original physical document as possible. But it's not necessarily going to want to be something that you'll like browse, because each image will take a million years to load. The file sizes are huge.
I actually really wanted to ask a question about that, because
Yeah, go ahead.
when I think about access versus preservation, I mean, especially coming from a video game perspective, I mean, more pixels equals better, right? And I know that sounds super dumb to your like high resolution
More
image.
polygons,
more polygons, more. But no, it's true, right? Like, and I really love
Yeah.
books. I really love reading physical copies of books. And so hearing you say that preservation is going to create kind of a higher quality version, or maybe not quality is the right word. Maybe the better word is fidelity. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here. But I am really curious, like, what's kind of the motivation between having like an accessible copy that might not be as easy to read, or are there even reading differences between like
it's
an
actually
access
that
copy?
it's going to be, the access copy is
Oh.
intended to be easier
Okay,
to read
yeah,
and
yeah.
easier to use. Because if you think about it, like let's say your digital object is just like a PDF. And, you know, most people when they're reading a PDF, they probably will just like scroll through it as rapidly as they want to. But the thing is, like, so for example, a fairly common standard for preservation copies, at least for digital images for preservation copies, is to shoot at 600 DPI. If you turn that into a PDF, like every time you would scroll to a new page, you'd probably have to wait a solid like 30 seconds just for the next page to load. So it's not going to be a particularly useful or, you know, accessible reading experience. So you produce something at a much lower resolution, which is much more readable and is also much more optimized. And this is actually something that's relevant for games as well, because, you know, a really important part of video game design, especially like when you're trying to produce something to ship, is optimization. In other words, you're trying to remove all of the shit from memory that would make the game run more slowly. So you're only trying to load into memory exactly as much as you need in order to have like that enjoyable, like, you know, high graphic quality gameplay experience.
Okay,
And so like
makes a
that
lot
in
more
many ways
sense.
is the analogy to the access copy.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. And I think for me, like, that actually provides a better understanding of like maybe where we're going to be going with the topic of like true preservation of these materials versus just having ways that like I'm frustrated by not being able to access video games.
True may not be the right word, maybe like high and low fidelity.
High and low fidelity ways of accessing the materials.
Yeah. Because it's not true, because it's a
Yeah,
transferred
it's true.
thing.
I was using true. Yes, you're
Yeah.
correct. I was using true as more of a shorthand, right?
Yeah.
And they're both accurate for those different modes and those different purposes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You can use it as a shorthand for like the highest fidelity copy that you could possibly produce.
Right, but it's not
one of the-
necessarily why you would want that, right? Like that's not your
Yeah.
motivation for. You don't need that if you're actually needing to play it or to read it.
Yeah, but one of the reasons why I wanted to identify these four modes is precisely because they each kind of call into question what is actually meant by fidelity. Like what are you being faithful to? Is fidelity purely a question of like graphic fidelity, which especially for older games is actually incredibly easy to achieve? But do you mean fidelity in terms of like the user experience, which is why, you know, original hardware now becomes a question that you have to start asking? Is it like preserving an entire social context? Is it preserving like the documentation that's associated with a particular game? Like, is that part of the fidelity question? For some people, yes, and for other people, no, it's not. And so that's why I wanted to break it down into these like four categories, because each of them points to, I mean, this isn't even meant to be comprehensive. It's just like, here is another way to think about the fidelity question.
I want to like queue up a question about this because I definitely feel like there is a question burning in my brain, but unfortunately this is just
Okay.
isn't my topic of expertise. And so for me, I'm like,
How about
how do I accurately ask you about like the different types of preservation, right?
Well, we can just get into it. I mean, we have,
Yeah.
Lauren, we have show notes that I know you're looking at because I can see your little cursor.
Yeah, I see my little cursor, and I'm literally like, there is no question here. So everybody, I'm trying to interview Nicholas for this thing, and I literally have like these lines of questions, but they're all very detailed for me specifically in my
Yeah.
head, and none of them are just like, so tell me more. And so that's literally what I was like, tell me more, Nicholas.
Okay, so let's get into one of these categories.
Let's get into
So
one of those categories.
these are not like official designations for these things. These are sort of like my shorthand for them.
Oh, okay. That would have been a really good question. If we ever do this again,
Yeah.
guys, that would have been the question. It's like, I see that you have labels on the modes of preservation. Are these?
Yeah. So the first one that I want to talk about is the one that probably a lot of like hardcore, like especially people working in the academy, will think of as like the way to do video game preservation. And that's to, as much as possible, maintain the original software with its original hardware. And so, for example, if you want to think about this in terms of, say, like a console game, that means not only preserving, like, say, like the cartridge for a Nintendo, it also means maintaining the Nintendos, and it also means maintaining the type of, like, audio-visual equipment that those systems would have been played on. So, in other words, that's saying, like, you want the Nintendo cartridge, you want the Nintendo Entertainment System, and you want a CRT display on which to play it. Because all of those things, and sometimes even many other things that I'm not even listing here, are considered to be part of the total picture. But it's a very hardware-centric idea of what fidelity is. In other words, the software by itself isn't enough. Because if that were the case, then you would just play, ROMs on an emulator. And for a lot of people, that is perfectly fine. But so to use an example of a place that does this, if you happen to be in Rochester, New York, one of probably the number one place I recommend people to go, with the exception of the Kodak House, is the Strong Museum of Play. And the reason why is because they have not only a huge archive of like historical game stuff, like, because they collect pretty much everything, not just like software and documents. They also collect like hardware. And the thing is, you can go there and you can play all kinds of different games on their original hardware. They have arcade cabinets, they have console systems, they have pinball machines. And so the idea that it's not just that like the archivists are trying to maintain like the original hardware as best they can in its sort of like original condition. They're also trying to reproduce the entire sort of like for example, all of their arcade cabinets are arranged in an arcade. In other words, they're trying to give the environmental context for the way in which those games are played. And it is kind of important because like one of the things it does manage to recreate is the kind of like constant wall of sound that you would have from all of the machines around you, like operating simultaneously. Like to me, as someone who grew up as like that being my primary like video game experience was in arcades and bowling alleys, like to walk into a dark room and the first thing you get hit with is that wall of sound, all of the weird beeps and all like the chip tunes and whatnot, like it immediately transports you back to a kind of subjective experience even before you start playing at a machine.
And I was going to say that for me, like when we talk about kind of like that DIY kind of you're in a space, like in the arcade space, like for me, like I really love, so I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and one of the places that we have is the Alameda Pinball Museum. And absolutely what you're talking about, like I can hear that, those sounds whenever I like in my head right now, even when I'm not there. And it's really like interesting to kind of think about how like I actually used to play a lot of pinball as the PC version. And that was my first, I would say like oh my gosh, it's not It was the first time I played pinball was on a PC. And I think that's like a really strange thing to say out loud because I obviously had more access to probably real pinball machines. They just weren't in areas where my parents would take me as a kid, right? Because that wasn't something they did. But when I realized that pinball was like a real thing, I was like, arcades are the only place I'm going as a kid now, guys. Maybe that's why. They just knew. They knew that I would be distracted by the shiny lights. And I think that's something that I really love too, is that when I was also in Texas, because my parents decided to retire in Texas, is that they have the National Video Game Museum is there as well, which is even stranger because that preservation mode you're talking about when you recreate a space, like you're kind of inundated with all of those sounds and a visceral like attachment. And if you remember that, there's nostalgia. The Video Game Museum feels like that, but like removed, like you're like a fishbowl, like I'm watching you enter the arcade and I'm observing your behavior. It's actually an incredibly like unsettling experience because it's done by timeline, and so you start with kind of like the Atari and the brown box and those like the first game consoles, and then like you kind of move into it.
In many ways, that's kind of like the museumification of an experience.
And I wanted to kind of talk about the museumification of an experience because I think that is a way in which a lot of people, when we think about preserving like artifacts, right? Like tangible things, like we think about museuming them, but you don't really museum a game experience necessarily.
It's difficult. And one of the things that I think the Strong Museum especially does really well, because like they do exhibits, and like they like when I was there the last time, they had an entire exhibit up for Roberta Williams, a very very famous like pioneering game designer. But that was in a completely separate area from where like all of the like this like sensory experience that I was describing earlier was set up. In other words, those two things, like the museum-y stuff and the kind of like trying to preserve and maintain a subjective experience stuff, are totally divorced from one another. They're kept completely separate.
Okay. That feels better to me, just hearing about it like that.
Yeah, so that way you can still have the sort of like educational experience where you're like, you know, you learn about, say, like a particular designer or a particular movement or like a particular period in video game history. You can still like have that kind of 10,000 foot view of things. But then you can also have like the deeply personal, like really subjective experience as well. And I think they understand that like you do actually have to keep those things like sequestered from each other.
Yeah. And then to be clear, what I was talking about the Alameda Pinball Museum, I was being very specific that it is a pinball like recreation. It's more of an arcade. You actually go and have like, you could have couples play and it's all play for like $22. So it's like $11 a person. And it's couples because it's really just two for a discount. It's not like any couple, like couples. Versus like the National Video Game Museum definitely feels like a like walking exhibit. So those are like kind of my two kind of experiences with this type of method.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier that it's more common in academia, but it's not exclusive to academia. Although it generally speaking is what you're going to see in academic context. Like for example, the media library, they call it something else now, but it was the media library when I was at the University of Michigan. They're very much focused on like maintaining consoles, maintaining like CRT displays, and kind of maintaining and preserving that like home, like couch gameplay experience.
Yeah, and I was actually just going to say that it's like, but we actually can't just go to a museum like and sit on the same couch and play one game for 6 hours, because they're going to be like, no, this is for everybody. Right? So like, what is our options, right? And then to have that subjective experience, kind of like how it would have actually been to play. Maybe not just in arcade machines, right? Or the original hardware of consoles we no longer have. Like I don't have the PS1 anymore. Or at least not with me. I think I do have a PS2 somewhere in my parents', pile of cardboard boxes, right?
Well, this is where it becomes kind of complicated, because this is kind of where you can go in two directions. Because one of the problems with the like obsession with like hardware and context and all that stuff is that there are contexts that you just can't recreate. You can't recreate a Pizza Hut in the 1980s that has like a cafe style Frogger sitting in the corner, while like, crappy 80s tunes are like playing on the jukebox in the other corner of the room. Like you can't do that because you can't just like take over a Pizza Hut and create a preservation environment inside.
Oh,
Like
though
you
Pizza
can't.
Huts are getting their red roof back, so maybe
That
one
that is, that
day.
is true. But what I'm saying is that like there was a way in which, especially like arcade cabinets, were kind of just out in the world in the 80s and early 90s. That isn't really true anymore, unless you're talking about like, say, like a big game hunter machine in a bar, or like video poker and things like that are, you also commonly see in bars. Like that in many ways is this like the contemporary analog to that historical situation where you would more typically see these things out there. Whereas like what I'm just talking about is kind of an artificial recreation. Is sort of, it is a bit nostalgia baity.
Yeah.
And so then the thing is like, okay, well, what if I want to have that console experience, but like I personally don't know how to solder PCBs, because that's actually kind of what you need to know how to do if you're going to try and maintain the original equipment. It's like, well, okay, especially starting in like the late 90s and especially into the 2000s, there started to develop, especially on the internet, a trade in what are essentially like disk images and ROMs for older video games. And these things would be traded, between people in like IRC chats. Sometimes you would see them on various, things that exist in the past, like, Kazaa or LimeWire. But for me personally, I much more commonly saw them traded in like IRC chats. Nowadays, you would probably find them on like BitTorrent, because they have a kind of quasi-legal character, and I'm saving the legal issues for the end because that's a huge fucking issue, and I can't do it as just like an aside. And so this is the model that, say, like the Internet Archive has adopted, where emulation is sort of like the primary mode, because their primary mode of dissemination is through the internet. In other words, they can't really do the sort of like hardcore, you have to play everything on its original hardware, because that's just not what they are as a cultural heritage institution. Like, they are a fully online thing. And so then in that environment, for them, the question of fidelity is less about like trying to recreate an entire subjective experience, and more sort of like they're veering more towards the access side of things. In other words, if something like the Strong Museum of Play is sort of like 100% on the like preserve everything side of the equation, then in many ways something like the Internet Archive's like collection of video games through emulators, and also computer games that they emulate online, that sort of like sits in the middle between sort of like the question of access and preservation. I mean, because I'm not going to say that it's fully on the access side, for the very reason that like a lot of what they're finding and putting up online are like old demos of video games, or like shareware versions of games. And this is just as important for the historical research, because this is preserving a mode of dissemination for these games that doesn't exist anymore. Like, shareware games don't really exist
Yeah,
anymore.
I was going to kind of say, like, that's a big reason why I actually purchase a lot of the physical copies today of, like, games, and I have a disc version of the PlayStation 5. Because
Yeah.
I want to be able to, and it's not quite shareware, just so we're all clear here on, like, terminology, but it is I have something that if someone was wanted to play, right, like Insomniac's Spider-Man, and they didn't want to buy it, or they didn't want to download it, or they just, they also had a disc version of the PlayStation, which is actually rarer. Um, but if they did, right, we could kind of have one game and kind of trade it back and forth. But now I found myself in the digital, I hate saying things like the digital age, because this is the age I am in. But like in things where everything's digitized now, I do find myself realizing that it's like, okay, well, it's just easier to buy it digitally, and then just kind of like trade around which games I have downloaded all at once, rather than trying to improve how much storage I have for all of these different games that I've downloaded. It's very interesting, but I actually wanted to, so that's kind of like the real world, kind of like today's kind of version of this. But I also would say, like, these are types of things that are like emulators, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like
So
I like emulation because there are games that I like. I really loved Carmen San Diego's Great Chase Through Time as a kid. That was my sweet spot as a kid in elementary school.
yeah.
Because the Carmen San Diego games were great. I actually remember being heartbroken when I finally found that copy on a CD-ROM I still had an old, I say old, but like I had one of the last gaming laptops that was like, I think 20 pounds. It was insane, guys. It was 18 inches for a screen. It was like massive. You had to buy a special backpack for it. Slash,
Yeah.
like you had to have one of those gamer backpacks, if anybody remembers what
Oh
those were
my
like.
god.
No, you had to have a gamer backpack. It had a poncho in it so that like you could protect your bag. Like the bag had a poncho.
Wait, there was a poncho like built into
Yeah, it
the
was a
backpack?
poncho built into the bag. Like there was a
Oh
little
my
cabin,
God.
like zipped, and you unzipped it. This was a gamer bag, okay?
Okay, all right, all right.
And
all
I'm
right.
a small human. Like my torso's not like I have a pretty long torso actually, which I get away with it. But then I just even look more like
No,
a
no, you're
turtle.
not a small human. You're a short queen.
I thank you. I'm a short queen, and I was a short queen turtle, or tortoise rather. I was very slow. Was not moving in the water. But yeah, no. Okay. The point of this really giant ass laptop is that I put in my disk for Carmen San Diego and I was like, sorry, this format is no longer supported by this operating system.
Yeah.
Like the operating
Yeah.
systems and the softwares, right, are no longer allowed to handle it, even though it's technically still, you could say, like a PC, right? So now, in order to play this disk, I would have to go and get a computer, but also install like Windows 2000,
Yeah.
right? And
So
I think,
actually,
and that's,
yeah.
yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say is that this is actually like directly relevant to the issues that we had with Metal Gear Solid 4 because until the the Master Collection Volume 2 was announced, we were literally looking into like I was going to purchase a physical copy of the disc and then use a heavily modded emulator to run it and possibly even like copy the copy a disk image for Lauren so that she could do the same thing on her PC at home. And we were like, oh my God. And also like everything that was reading online was saying that like, well, even like heavily modded, the emulator doesn't necessarily work the greatest. And I'm like
Yeah,
it's a huge hassle. Like emulators are not perfect. I mean, if it's okay, generally speaking, the older the game is, the better an emulator is going to work with it because of the fact that like when you're talking about a console, it doesn't actually have to go through like a shell layer in order to like operate the software that's on the disk. Whereas the problem with like say playing something like say playing a PS2 game on your computer is that like you have the shell layer of your computer's operating system, but then you have the layer of the emulator, and then you finally get to the software that's on the disk.
right.
And
And I
so
mean,
like
like, and it's
yeah.
it's such a hassle, and it is true that like the terminology is like shellware. But for anybody out there that's like just not quite at the technical level of an expert like Nicholas here, and also for Lauren who like has already had to have this discussion before, right? Because we've talked about this like personally,
Yeah.
and it's basically just like multiple and multiple layers of like walls that you kind of have
Yeah,
to
you can
get
think of it as
through.
like you're running a program that's running a program that's running a program, and
Right.
how memory inefficient that's going to be.
Or visually, it's like many sheets of paper you have to get through just to get to the game.
Yeah,
And I
exactly.
I
Yeah.
think of things super, super visually. So for me, like I am literally imagining like the Cyberpunk 2077 Blackwall right now, but instead it's just multiple thin layers of that, where you just have to go past one, go past one, go past one, because it's just so much of it's just so much of like the shell software, but it's just so much of running software on top of software on top of software, because a lot of these were supposed to be run on a different operating system, what is in the PS2, right?
Yeah, and
So
going
it's
back to and go back to like the original like the older days, especially like in the 2000s, like you generally had to do a lot of work just to get any individual to ROM to run properly like at all. And you had to have a degree of I mean, maybe it's technical expertise, but you did have to have a certain degree of know-how in terms of like how your individual computer runs and like various firmware settings and so forth, just to like get these things to work properly for playing like a Super Nintendo game. Like even with hardware that's far more advanced in terms of your PC than the like original Super Nintendo, there's so much crap that you have to sort of like figure out in terms of like matching clock speeds and like just lots of annoying shit. emulators are much more user-friendly nowadays. And also with the internet, there's a lot more information available to you online with regards to like how to configure them to play a particular game. So you're not necessarily like as much in the weeds. You don't have to be like you don't have to be a hacker just to play super Star Wars.
Oh man, I would love to. Okay, hold on. We're gonna, before we like go on tangents about all of the Star Wars games Lauren would love to play from the 90s that are just a little too challenging to play, but have been, say, remastered or remade. I think that this would be a great opportunity to then talk about another way that I think I've seen most of these older games being like remade for a new audience, right? Or saying, here's our refresh, is to talk about the remakes or the remasters, right? And all of how all different those are.
Yeah, and the problem is that like even within that realm, they take all kinds. So like for example, we've been primarily playing the Metal Gear Solid games from the Master Collection disc, which pretty faithfully reproduces and ports the original software. Like, there will be visual differences, but like for example, it will often give you the option to play like the various versions of the games from the various regions in which they were released, and that was something I actually really appreciated. And so for the most part, like in that instance, it's fine. But then if you think about, say, something like the Silent Hill 2 re-release, or
that's exactly what I was going to bring up.
To use an egregious example, the Final Fantasy VII remake, which is a different game. It's just a different game with the same characters.
Yeah,
and sort of the same story.
And sort of the same story. And that's what I was going to point out, is that in the Final Fantasy game, they actually talk about how they, like, in the characters themselves also talk about almost how they're on like a parallel track or a different kind of story to the Final Fantasy VII kind of original. And I feel like I'm of two minds of that. On the one hand, when we're talking about video game preservation and we're talking about trying to keep the experiences that we used to have pretty much as tangible as possible. And for Final Fantasy VII, you can actually kind of watch a lot of the original remakes of them already. Or sorry, you can already watch a lot of YouTube videos, playing the original game, either on original hardware or on original...
You can even still buy the original game. It's available on Steam right now.
Yeah, you can also buy the original game, right? And so I think that when we're talking about the remaster or like the remake, right, of Final Fantasy VII, it's very different than I would say of the remaster is how I would call it. Final Fantasy VII feels like a remake, and I think the game acknowledges it. But a remaster that I would consider to be Persona 3 Reloaded. Right? I did actually play the original as a digital download on the PlayStation 3, though I believe it came out on the PlayStation 2 originally. And that game, when I remember playing it on the PlayStation 3, and then I played Persona 3 Reloaded, definitely felt like the same game.
Yeah.
Versus Final Fantasy VII absolutely changed like the combat, the level design, like they really lifted it up into a different, say, genre, you could say, right? So
yeah.
I think what's really super, valuable from a game development perspective here is that if you're looking at doing a remake, are you trying to remain faithful but now adhere to an audience that is used to, right, kind of those more like traditional kind of like action RPG elements and combat systems that they've come to know from your franchise, which I think is in Final Fantasy VII's case, versus or you could say in Square Enix's case, or was it Creative Business Development Studio, like 2 or something. I actually don't remember which one it is.
It's just
but I think it's just Square Enix. I don't know. They have so many. But versus like in Atlus's case, I feel like they very much just like said this was our game, and then they like, if they did recreate everything, they very much recreated everything, even down to like the janky like way you walk in that game, where you're like, I need to take the stairs, and it's like, do you mean run past the stairs? No, I need to take the stairs up. Do you mean run in front of the stairs this time? No, I need to take the stairs up. It's really funny to me because those are kind of two totally different philosophies, you could say, right? On trying to bring an older game to, I would say a new market, right? Even if you're the same, there's some players who play P3 like me, right? But there's other players who never played it, have wanted to play it, and just waited, right, for a remaster.
Yeah, Silent Hill 2 is a really good example of that, because for the longest time, the only way you could play it is either on a PS2 or through an emulator playing the disc, or if you have a ROM for whatever reason, or sorry, a disc image for whatever reason. They are different things. Like that was the only way you could do it. And so like the version that was released, what was it, in 2024? Was it released?
Yeah.
It was a graphical update, but other than that, there wasn't a ton that was changed. I mean, I think there is one important like subjective change that they maybe didn't think of, which is that in the original Silent Hill 2, the way the fog works in the game is sort of like bivalent. It is both sort of like a way to create a kind of claustrophobia around the main character, but it's also just a hardware limitation. Like you just couldn't render as far. So it's like that was the rendering distance. But the thing is then when you update the game, then like you don't really have that constraint in place. And so then you're producing something that's like it, but doesn't really quite capture the same. I mean, I didn't personally feel as like claustrophobic playing the remake as I did the original.
And I could be, yeah, and I actually didn't look this up in advance, so apologies to everyone here, but there is an amazing GDC Vault talk from the Level Design Summit in 2025, where I believe one of the fantastic level designers talked about recreating the levels from Silent Hill 2, and she very much was talking, and I really hope that this is the right game, because I don't want to be typing on my keyboard and being super, super loud. And the reason why I'm bringing it up, even if it's not about Silent Hill 2, though I will, for the purposes of the podcast, I will be saying that it is that the language that she used, and it was so articulate, was about how we wanted to recreate the feelings of the game and of the specific level she worked on, without necessarily being limited by the limitations of the original. And so it was about how do we create something that kind of gives us the spirit of Silent Hill 2 with both the updated graphics, but also the updated player expectations of Silent Hill 2. And they were incredibly intentional, down to like different puzzle designs, different recreating of the different, I want to say recreating the puzzles, like, but also trying to remaster the puzzles for like a more graphic fidelity audience, right? And that kind of comes back to the low and high fidelity argument as well. And it was a fantastic GDC talk. Unfortunately, it's probably behind the paywall for the GDC Vault, and so it probably won't be released to the public here. But if you know anybody with GDC Vault access, I highly recommend going over to their house and somehow being able to use their account, you could say, and watch it. Together in a physical space. Well, so
to put a cap on this point, like, first of all, I want to be clear that like I don't think that the remake of Silent Hill 2 is an inferior game. What I'm trying to say is I think people aren't paying attention enough to the fact that like when you do these updates, how you're creating a new game that in many ways sort of alludes to or like refers back to some source text, but I think it's an open question as to whether or not you could even call this a mode of preservation, for precisely the reason that, like, because there are all of these expectations for updating various things, like adapting to quality of life issues, or like updating the graphics, or just doing the sorts of things that modern gamers are going to expect from a game. Like, you make a different game when you do that, and that's fine. Like, I'm not opposed to this, but it is a question as to whether or not, like, what exactly then are you preserving? And so I think that's a way to, I want to talk about the last mode before we, call it for this particular episode, which is what I'm going to call social preservation. And this is going to be, actually, there's something going on right now that sort of demonstrates that this is kind of going to be one of the primary frontiers with regards to video game preservation. So what am I calling social preservation? Well, there's an initiative in the EU right now called Stop Killing Games, and whatever you may think of the somewhat controversial figure who is spearheading it, the basic idea I think is actually a sound one, which is that government should be involved in regulating end of life for software. In other words, take the example of like a live service game. A live service game, say, like starts in 2016. It's really popular. It's running for years and years and years. And then in 2022, the company that is producing that game and is developing it and maintaining it, they decide that it's no longer profitable to do so. And Lauren, what is the most common thing that studios do in that situation?
Oh, I mean, they shut it down.
Yeah, they just
they have to shut it down. Yeah.
Yeah. So what this initiative is focused on is like, okay, studios can do that. That's perfectly fine. But from a regulatory perspective, they need to then come up with some way in which it can then kind of move over into a status where either someone else can pick up the maintenance, or it can be like put into the public domain and sort of like, as a more radical option, but something that can be done so that if like some number of players want to keep playing this game in some form, that the company has thought of a way in which that can be done while still not putting all of like the financial onus on them to keep it up even after it's no longer profitable.
And then correct me if I'm wrong, but before you make your point, this has actually already been done with previous games that have been live service games that users have taken upon themselves.
And I even have a couple examples in the show notes.
Okay.
Yeah. So the thing, but what's different about this particular example is that in previous ones, usually what happens is it's done on a more ad hoc basis. So there are examples where essentially like the company turns over the IP entirely to fans, and fans maintain servers themselves. A good example of this is what is now referred to as Return of Reckoning, which is a fan-produced and maintained version of Warhammer Age of Reckoning after the company that had been the studio that had produced it no longer was keeping it online. Like, it's still online to this day. You can go play it entirely for free. And so like that's one example of something that could be done, is that like the IP can just be handed over to somebody else with the presumption that they are not going to be maintaining it for profit. And I think that's a really important point, is that like if you're going to do this, it has to then just like be in the public domain. And the people who work on that project are very conscientious of this fact. And so they're not trying to step on the toes of the studio. They're just trying to say like, hey, if you're going to otherwise abandon this, can we come to some sort of arrangement so that the game can continue into the future? Because this is going to be a problem with the preservation of live service games. If they can just be shut down like on a whim, it's going to be very difficult to study them.
So what you're saying is this a currently ongoing kind of private citizen initiative to make the government get involved?
So it's currently in the hearing process in the EU Parliament. And there were hearings on it, I think, a couple of months ago. It was either a month ago or a couple of months ago. And so like they are actively working on EU legislation with regards to sort of what to do for like the total life cycle of specifically live service games.
Oh, you know what? Honestly, I wasn't up to date with what EU legislation was actually going through right now, because coming into the US, I feel like, man, that would be a totally different topic.
Oh, no, this would never happen in the U.S.
Yeah, this would never happen in the U.S. But I remember now you sharing the article about this, because I do think that having a live service, some sort of live service preservation, is somewhat important. But it's also something that, like, when you think about it, it's very interesting to think of a live service game, say, like, if Destiny or Destiny 2 no longer had support, right? Yeah. How many people would want an initiative like this so that they could keep kind of playing it? And in what state would you leave it, right?
Yeah, also, how would you pay for it? Because, like, those servers are expensive to operate.
Yeah, servers are incredibly expensive. And I think that's normally why game studios do tend to just shut it down. And it is because they, have a different type of fiscal responsibility, not only to their like company, but like to the staff, right? And a lot of developers at the time are like, there is work to maintain those.
Yeah.
right? And so the maintenance of the servers and everything there. So I think it's a really interesting kind of social preservation that you don't kind of think about when you think of games. Because when
Yeah.
I think about video games and I think about video game preservation, I both kind of think of it from the physical side, right? Of like collecting all of these discs or having
Yeah.
consoles and
Yeah.
maintaining the physical side. But that's not really accessible to everybody, which is where emulators kind of come in.
Yeah.
But then even that can be inaccessible. And so now it's like, how do we,
Yep.
right? Now it feels like the third way naturally was like, okay, let's re-release, right, the game. But once you get to the game, you actually, for a lot of intensive purposes, you don't actually have access to the code anymore. Or if you do get
Yeah.
access to the code, and a lot of times you can't run it anymore for the same reason I can't run Carmen Sandiego on my modern PC because the OS is too powerful, right? So you're just looking at code.
I mean, you probably could if you set up a shell environment in Windows that emulates the hardware.
I think you
that it
do,
originally
right? You
ran
just
on.
kind of port
Yeah.
the code over. But this was a
But
very
again,
big, and the reason
that's the
why
hacker thing. Yeah.
it's and I do actually love saying the hacker metaphor for this. And just to really quickly talk about like the cap and the idea that you've been given code and you can't run it, is that quite frankly, like you can't. Maya code updates with every single iteration, and Maya is a kind of it's like a 3D rigging and 3D character modeling software.
Yeah.
And I'm bringing up a software example here for like say character modeling or and Blender. I probably could happen to this too, but that you can create coded tools for those software systems. And what that means is that if they update, they use different syntax. If they if you have an older version and you try to run a newer updated code on the older version, it's just not going to run. It's not going to understand it. And this is same is true for video games. Even it uses the same coding language of C# or C++, right? It's that it's the same coding language, but the programs itself have different syntax. And so this happens a lot when basically the birth of Unreal Engine has come into play, where now everybody was trying to move old code from, say, proprietary software, proprietary engines. It just won't work in Unreal, right? The syntax is different. The way it is different. And if that's just trying to like make a current modern game, I can only imagine the hacking that has to go into other properties to try to get you to recreate, right, an example. So yeah. So Nicholas, go ahead and kind of give us a really strong conclusion for like the history of video game preservation, but also kind of like why it's important, right, for both preserving and accessibility.
Yeah. First, I want to note that I was originally going to talk about sort of the legal stuff at the end, but I think we're going to leave that for the Patreon episode because it's a little bit too long to talk about as a cap on the episode. But with regards to sort of like why preservation is important, for a whole host of reasons that like, so when I talked about the distinction between access and preservation earlier, it's important to note that that's a continuum. And the thing is, like, the goals of preservation and the goals of access are not necessarily, like, opposed to each other. It's just those sort of, like, pull what you end up doing in different directions. And the reason why this is so fundamentally important, and also, like, I know this from the digitization work that I do, that because of the nature of the internet and because of, like, how ubiquitous so many, like, digital repositories are nowadays, the more stuff you can get into them, the more exposure those things will get. And also then just like the better picture that people will have, not only historically, but also like I'm a huge advocate of playing old ass games just to sort of like experience their very weird, but sometimes really kind of interesting mechanics. Because there's a lot in contemporary game design circles is kind of just taken for granted in terms of like what you're supposed to do. And I think it's extremely helpful if you're someone who is, say, currently working on a game or you like to think about game design to go back and play these older games because, yeah, oftentimes the mechanics are extremely janky and will be annoying, but you will discover things that really kind of pique your interest. And also you'll start to learn why it was, say, for example, you know, roughly in like the 2010s, the games actually started to turn away from graphic fidelity as the only thing that sells a game. And it's precisely because, you know, you're seeing much lower resolution games that are focusing on other aspects that you could easily pull from a lot of these older games. Like, it would be worth just going back and playing those old Carmen Sandiego games and the way in which they sort of like structure the entire like detective-y thing.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, if you don't provide like as much fidelity or like as much access to these things as you possibly can, like that just can't happen.
And with that, thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of the Furidashi podcast. Lauren and Nicholas will return on the Patreon episode, so please go over to patreon.com is it / or backslash?
It's /
Furidashi. Thank you, Nicholas. And we can also see you on the lovely skies of blue. I am at Espresso Cat. And Nicholas is at Academicality. So we hope to see you there. And as always, if you have anything you want to say to us, you can reach out to us at any time.